In the months before her death, Cleopatra conducted experiments that would disturb even modern sensibilities. According to Plutarch, she tested various poisons on condemned prisoners, observing their deaths with clinical detachment to determine which substances killed most quickly and with the least suffering. She tried venoms from different snakes and discovered that they caused too much pain and took too long to work. She tried plant-based poisons and found that some were fast but caused visible convulsions that distorted the face. She was searching for the perfect death, quick, painless, peaceful, leaving the body beautiful and composed for whatever came after. This was not the behavior of a woman resigned to fate or overwhelmed by grief. This was systematic research conducted by someone who intended to control every aspect of her final moment, including how her body would appear when it was discovered. The guards who found Cleopatra reported that she looked as if she were sleeping, her face serene, her body unmarked except for 2 tiny punctures that might have been needle marks or insect bites. Her 2 most loyal handmaidens were dead beside her in the same peaceful condition. Whatever killed Cleopatra was fast, painless, and left no obvious trace, characteristics that match certain plant-based toxins perfectly and match cobra venom not at all. The asp was a beautiful lie that served Roman propaganda, but the truth was something Cleopatra designed herself, the final masterpiece of a queen who refused to let anyone else control her story. Before we examine the scientific evidence that demolishes the snake myth and explore what really killed the last pharaoh of Egypt, we need to understand why Cleopatra was so determined to die on her own terms and what she was trying to prevent. If you find yourself drawn into this ancient mystery, consider subscribing to join us as we uncover more of history's hidden truths. The summer of 30 BC had brought nothing but catastrophe for the Queen of Egypt. Her lover, Mark Antony, had fallen on his sword after receiving false news of her death, and she had watched him die in her arms, his blood soaking her robes as he took his final breaths. Her kingdom was surrounded by the legions of Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, who had pursued her across the Mediterranean and now stood at the gates of Alexandria, demanding her surrender. Her children were scattered, Caesarion sent south toward Ethiopia in a desperate attempt to save his life. Her 3 children by Antony still in the palace awaiting whatever fate Octavian would decree. Her treasury was depleted. Her allies had abandoned her, and her fleet had been destroyed at the Battle of Actium the previous year. Everything she had built over 2 decades of rule was crumbling around her, and she knew with absolute certainty that Octavian intended to take her to Rome and display her in his triumphal parade. Dragged in chains through the streets, while Roman crowds jeered and threw garbage at the last queen of Egypt. This was the fate that Cleopatra was determined to avoid, and this was why she had spent months researching the most effective methods of suicide. The Roman triumph was not merely a humiliation. It was a carefully staged ritual of degradation designed to demonstrate Rome's absolute dominance over its defeated enemies. Captive kings and queens were forced to walk behind the victor's chariot, often in chains, sometimes in cages, displayed like exotic animals for the entertainment of the Roman mob. Some captives were executed at the end of the procession, strangled in the Tullianum prison as a final demonstration of Roman power. Others were kept alive but reduced to the status of slaves or dependents, stripped of all dignity and autonomy, living reminders of what happened to those who defied Rome. Cleopatra had seen such triumphs described in Roman texts and heard about them from Roman visitors to her court. She knew exactly what awaited her if she allowed herself to be taken alive, and she knew that death was preferable to such complete and public destruction of everything she represented. The experiments on condemned prisoners were therefore not acts of cruelty, but acts of practical research, the same systematic approach that Cleopatra brought to every problem she faced. She needed a poison that would kill quickly enough that she could not be revived by Octavian's physicians, painlessly enough that she would not suffer in her final moments, and cleanly enough that her body would remain beautiful and composed for discovery. This last requirement was not vanity, but politics. She wanted to be found looking like a queen, not twisted in agony or disfigured by convulsions, because her appearance in death would be her final statement to the world. The ancient sources report that she tested poisons on prisoners of various ages and constitutions, carefully noting the time to death, the level of pain, and the appearance of the body afterward. She was looking for the perfect formula, and she was willing to spend months finding it. The snake venoms failed her tests comprehensively. Plutarch specifically records that Cleopatra found ASP venom unsatisfactory because it caused too much suffering before death finally came. Modern toxicology confirms this assessment with clinical precision. The Egyptian cobra, the species most commonly identified as Cleopatra's asp, produces a neurotoxic venom that attacks the nervous system and causes progressive paralysis of the muscles, including the muscles that control breathing. Death from cobra envenomation typically takes several hours and involves severe pain at the bite site, extensive swelling, difficulty breathing, and often convulsions as the nervous system fails. The victim remains conscious for much of this process, fully aware of what is happening as their body slowly shuts down. This is not the quick, peaceful death that the ancient sources describe for Cleopatra, and it is not the death that her experiments would have led her to choose. The physical logistics of the snake also present insurmountable problems. An Egyptian cobra capable of delivering a lethal dose of venom would need to be at least 5 feet long, and such a snake could not possibly be concealed in a small basket of figs as the legend claims. The cobra's venom glands contain a limited amount of toxin, and a single snake would be unlikely to have enough venom remaining after the first bite to deliver lethal doses to 2 more victims. Cobras are also notoriously difficult to handle and cannot be reliably induced to bite on command. Snake handlers who work with cobras professionally report that the snakes often refuse to bite or deliver dry bites with no venom when they feel threatened. The stress of being smuggled in a basket, handled by unfamiliar people, and forced to bite multiple times would make a cobra even less likely to cooperate with such a plan. The idea that Cleopatra could have smuggled a large, dangerous snake past Octavian's guards, then convinced it to bite her at precisely the right moment, and then had enough venom left over to kill her 2 handmaidens as well, stretches credibility well beyond the breaking point. The romantic image of the asp simply does not survive contact with biological reality. So what did kill Cleopatra? The ancient sources themselves point toward the answer, though they do not identify it with certainty. Plutarch mentions several alternative theories that circulated in his own time. A poison concealed in a hollow hairpin, a toxic ointment applied to the skin, a poisoned drink. Cassius Dio notes that small puncture marks were found on Cleopatra's arm, which could have been needle marks from an injection or small cuts used to introduce poison into the bloodstream. Modern toxicologists and medical historians have proposed various candidates for the actual poison, and the evidence points most strongly toward a combination of plant-based toxins that would have produced exactly the symptoms that the ancient sources describe. The leading candidate is a mixture of hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium, 3 substances that were well known in the ancient world and readily available in Alexandria. Hemlock contains conine, a neurotoxin that causes ascending paralysis similar to cobra venom but much faster and less painful. Wolfsbane contains aconitine, an extremely potent toxin that causes rapid cardiac arrest. Opium provides sedation and pain relief, ensuring that the victim feels peaceful and drowsy rather than distressed as death approaches. Combined in the right proportions, these 3 substances would produce exactly the death that Cleopatra was searching for: quick, painless, peaceful, leaving the body unmarked and serene. A small dose could be delivered through a needle prick or a small cut, explaining the puncture marks that were found on her arm without requiring a snake that could not have been there. This theory is supported by Cleopatra's known interest in toxicology and pharmacology. She was reportedly the author of a treatise on cosmetics and medicines that survived into the medieval period before being lost, and she would have had access to the finest physicians and scholars in Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria contained texts on poisons and their antidotes from Greek, Egyptian, and Eastern sources, and Cleopatra had the resources and the education to understand and apply this knowledge. Egyptian medicine had a long tradition of working with plant-based compounds, and the priests who served in the temples possessed extensive knowledge of herbs and their effects that they would have shared with their queen. Cleopatra was also known to have studied under scholars at the Mouseion, the research institution attached to the library, where she would have learned systematic methods of inquiry and experimentation. The idea that she developed her own poison formula through systematic experimentation is entirely consistent with what we know about her character and her capabilities. She was not a passive victim waiting for death. She was an active agent designing her own exit on her own terms. But if the snake did not kill Cleopatra, why did the story of the asp become the official version of her death? The answer lies in Roman propaganda and the political needs of Octavian, who had every reason to promote a version of events that served his interests and undermined Cleopatra's legacy. The asp was a powerful symbol in Egyptian religion and royal iconography. The uraeus, the rearing cobra, appeared on the crowns of the pharaohs as a symbol of divine authority and protection. By claiming that Cleopatra died from an asp bite, the Roman version of events could be read as a kind of divine judgment, the sacred serpent of Egypt turning against its queen and delivering the punishment she deserved for defying Rome. The story also made Cleopatra's death seem more passive and fatalistic than it actually was, obscuring the careful planning and deliberate control that she exercised over her final moments. Octavian had additional reasons to prefer the snake story over the truth. If Cleopatra had developed an undetectable poison, that knowledge represented a potential threat. Others might use the same formula for assassination or suicide, and Octavian himself might be vulnerable to such methods. By promoting the snake narrative, he could avoid drawing attention to the existence of such poisons and discourage others from researching them. The snake story was also more dramatic and memorable than a simple poisoning, which meant it would spread more effectively and become the dominant narrative more quickly. Octavian was a master of propaganda, and he understood that the most effective stories are not necessarily the most accurate ones. They are the ones that people want to believe and want to repeat. He had already used propaganda brilliantly against Antony, portraying him as a degenerate enslaved to an Eastern queen, and he applied the same skills to shaping the narrative of Cleopatra's death. The asp story allowed him to close the chapter on the Egyptian threat with a satisfying image that would resonate through the centuries, obscuring the more complicated truth of a queen who outsmarted him, even in her final moments. The physical evidence that Octavian's own soldiers reported actually contradicts the snake narrative quite directly. The guards found Cleopatra lying on her golden couch, dressed in her royal robes, looking peaceful and beautiful as if she were merely sleeping. Her handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, were dead beside her. Iris on the floor, and Charmian barely alive, struggling to adjust the queen's crown before she, too, collapsed. No snake was found in the room despite an extensive search. No evidence of snakebite was visible on the bodies except for the tiny puncture marks on Cleopatra's arm that could have had many explanations. Octavian reportedly brought snake charmers and specialists in snake venom to try to revive the queen, which suggests that even he was not certain that a snake had been involved. The snake was simply the explanation that made the best story, and once that story began to spread, it became impossible to stop. The death of Cleopatra was therefore her final victory over Octavian, achieved through careful planning and executed with the same intelligence and determination that had characterized her entire reign. She denied him the triumph he wanted, the spectacle of the last queen of Egypt dragged through Rome in chains. She denied him control over the narrative of her death, substituting her own carefully designed exit for whatever fate he had planned for her. She denied him the satisfaction of seeing her broken and humiliated, presenting instead a body that looked peaceful and dignified, a queen even in death. And she denied him the truth, leaving behind a mystery that he could not solve, and that would be debated for 2,000 years. The ASP became his explanation, his attempt to regain control of a narrative that Cleopatra had wrested from him. But it was never the truth. The truth was something that Cleopatra took with her to the grave. The two handmaidens who died with Cleopatra deserve their own recognition in this story, because their deaths reveal something important about how the suicide was carried out. Iris and Charmian were not slaves but high-ranking attendants who had served Cleopatra for years, and their decision to die alongside their queen was voluntary, an act of loyalty that the Romans themselves admired even as they condemned Cleopatra. The Roman soldier who discovered the scene reportedly asked Charmian whether this was well done, and she replied that it was extremely well done, fitting for the descendant of so many kings. This exchange, recorded by Plutarch, shows that even the Romans recognized the dignity and courage of Cleopatra's death, even as they tried to diminish it with the snake story. The three women died together by the same method at roughly the same time, which strongly suggests a poison that could be administered in controlled doses rather than a snake that would have needed to bite 3 times with diminishing effectiveness. The timing of the deaths also argues against the snake and for the poison. The guards found Iris already dead, Charmian barely alive, and Cleopatra apparently dead, but perhaps only recently so. If a single snake had bitten all 3 women, the first victim would have died long before the last, given the time required for cobra venom to kill. The fact that all 3 died within a short period suggests a poison that was administered simultaneously or in quick succession, with each woman receiving a measured dose designed to kill within a specific time frame. This level of control would be impossible with a snake, but entirely possible with a prepared poison, especially one that had been tested and refined through months of experimentation. Cleopatra had calculated the dosages and the timing to ensure that she and her attendants would die together, a final demonstration of her mastery over the circumstances of her death. The body of Cleopatra was treated with respect by Octavian, which tells us something about his own recognition of her stature, and perhaps his frustration at being denied his triumph. He allowed her to be buried beside Mark Antony in the mausoleum she had prepared for them, with full royal honors and the rituals appropriate to a queen of Egypt. The location of this tomb has never been found, despite centuries of searching and numerous claims of discovery. Some archaeologists believe it lies beneath the modern city of Alexandria, destroyed or buried by the construction and destruction of the intervening millennia. Others have proposed locations outside the city, near temples or monuments associated with Cleopatra's reign. The search continues to this day, and if the tomb is ever found, it might contain evidence that finally resolves the question of how Cleopatra died. Until then, we are left with the ancient sources, the scientific analysis, and the overwhelming probability that the asp was a myth from the very beginning. The legend of the asp has proven remarkably durable despite its implausibility, which tells us something about the power of a good story over mere factual accuracy. The image of Cleopatra with the snake is visually striking, symbolically rich, and emotionally satisfying in ways that a simple poisoning could never be. It connects her death to Egyptian religion and royal iconography, giving it a mythic quality that transcends the sordid reality of a conquered queen killing herself to avoid humiliation. It allows artists and writers to create dramatic death scenes with the beautiful queen and the deadly serpent, images that have been reproduced countless times across 2,000 years of Western culture. The snake story has become so embedded in our collective imagination that many people resist the scientific evidence against it, preferring the legend to the likely truth. This is itself a kind of testament to Cleopatra's enduring power. Even in death, she remains a figure who inspires fantasy and resists reduction to mere historical fact. But the truth, as best as we can reconstruct it, is more impressive than the legend. The real Cleopatra did not passively accept a snakebite as divine judgment or poetic fate. She spent months researching poisons, testing them on human subjects, and developing a formula that would give her exactly the death she wanted. She planned every detail of her final scene, from her royal robes to the positioning of her body on the golden couch. She included her most loyal attendants in her plans, ensuring that they could die with her rather than face whatever punishment Octavian might inflict on them. She timed her death to deny Octavian his triumph, while leaving enough ambiguity about the method to prevent him from claiming complete understanding or control. She transformed her suicide from an act of desperation into an act of defiance, her final statement of autonomy in a situation where she had lost all other forms of power. The woman who emerged from a carpet to meet Julius Caesar, who sailed to Tarsus dressed as Aphrodite to meet Mark Antony, staged her own death with the same theatrical brilliance and meticulous attention to detail. The Aesop myth also obscures the genuine courage that Cleopatra's death required. Suicide is not easy, regardless of the method, and suicide by poison requires a particular kind of resolve, the willingness to swallow or inject a substance, knowing that it will kill you, then wait for death to come while remaining calm and composed. Cleopatra did not flinch from this task. She did not change her mind at the last moment or cry out for help. She took her poison, arranged herself on her couch, and died with the dignity she had planned. This required a strength of will that the snake story actually undermines, since it suggests a kind of passive acceptance rather than active choice. The truth is that Cleopatra chose to die, chose the method, chose the timing, and chose the staging, exercising control over the one thing that Octavian could not take from her, the manner of her own death. Modern forensic analysis has added further evidence against the ASP theory. Studies of cobra envenomation in the medical literature show that death typically takes 2 to 6 hours and involves progressive symptoms, including pain, swelling, difficulty breathing, and often paralysis of the eyelids and facial muscles. Victims do not look peaceful and beautiful. They look like people who have been poisoned, with visible signs of distress and physical deterioration. The quick, serene death described by the ancient sources is simply inconsistent with cobra venom, regardless of how much we might want to believe the romantic legend. The plant-based poison theory, by contrast, matches the described symptoms almost perfectly. Hemlock causes paralysis without convulsions, opium provides sedation and peace, and aconitine causes rapid heart failure that would end life quickly once the other substances had taken effect. The question of why Octavian promoted the snake story despite probably knowing it was false reveals something important about the nature of propaganda in the ancient world. Octavian did not need the story to be true. He needed it to be believed, and he needed it to serve his political purposes. The snake story made Cleopatra's death seem fated and appropriate, the natural consequence of her defiance of Rome and her corruption of Roman generals. It allowed Octavian to present himself as the restorer of order rather than the destroyer of an ancient kingdom. since the queen had killed herself rather than being executed by his command. It gave the Roman people a satisfying narrative of divine justice, with the sacred serpent of Egypt punishing the woman who had threatened to bring Eastern decadence and despotism to Rome. The story worked, and that was all that mattered to Octavian. The truth was irrelevant compared to the political utility of the myth. 2,000 years later, we can finally see through the propaganda to the likely reality beneath. Cleopatra died by her own hand, using a poison she had developed through careful research, administered in a way that left no obvious trace and produced the peaceful death she desired. She was not the passive victim of a snakebite, but the active author of her own end, controlling her final moments with the same intelligence and determination that had characterized her entire life. She denied Octavian his triumph, preserved her dignity, and left behind a mystery that has never been fully solved. The Asp was a useful fiction that served Roman purposes, but the truth was something more impressive. A queen who refused to let anyone else write the ending of her story. The death of Cleopatra on August 12, 30th BC, marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the end of pharaonic Egypt, and the end of an era in Mediterranean history that had lasted for 3,000 years. The kingdom that had been ruled by the descendants of Alexander the Great's general for 3 centuries became a Roman province, directly controlled by the emperor and exploited for its grain and wealth. The Library of Alexandria continued for several more centuries, but eventually declined and was destroyed, and the intellectual culture that Cleopatra had patronized faded into memory. The queen herself became a legend, her story told and retold across millennia, her image painted and sculpted and filmed by countless artists who imagined her according to their own times and their own desires. But through all these retellings, the asp has remained constant, the snake that almost certainly never existed continuing to define how we imagine Cleopatra's death. Perhaps it is time to let the serpent go and see the queen as she really was, not a romantic victim of fate, but a brilliant strategist who controlled her own death as she had tried to control her own life, not a woman waiting for a snake to bite, but a researcher who spent months developing the perfect poison, not a passive symbol of Eastern decadence, but an active agent who denied her enemy the satisfaction of total victory. She tested her poisons on the condemned because she needed certainty. She chose her method because she demanded control. She staged her death scene because she understood the power of images. And she left behind a mystery because she knew that uncertainty would preserve her legend better than any confirmed fact. The asp was Rome's story. The poison was Cleopatra's truth. And the truth, as always, is more interesting than the legend.